Hey, thank you. And we're in the home stretch. You guys ready? Okay, cool. And you got a beer too. How about that? It is after 5, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so Gav, are we in the golden age or not?
The golden age of blockchain. I would say we are. I think we're in the golden age, but I think we're coming to the end of the golden age.
Why?
I think we're seeing a lot of. We've had a lot of like cool projects, a lot of openness.
Yeah.
A general assumption that if you come to this space, then you develop open source. You develop in the open. You release your research in the open. You collaborate. You do cool events like these, and in general, you're all working towards roughly the same goal. And I think as time goes on, as the easy money goes away and the more difficult money starts to swamp the space, then we're going to have a sort of different forces pulling at the space.
Okay, we'll get to the forces in a sec. So let's start with the positive note for a bit. What's the one thing that you're most excited about in terms of development in blockchain? And how has that changed over the last, say, 6 or 12 months?
Yeah, I mean, there are a few interesting currents, definitely, and I think, you talk to a lot of people, and they'll start saying things like scalability, and it's like, yeah, sure, it's kind of an interesting technical problem.
Yeah.
I think governance is the sort of the single point of focus for me at the moment, and I think, when you start realizing that these things, these economic systems that we're building have such magnitude, such power taken as a whole, then the idea of governance is really quite interesting.
So you talked about forces. So let's there's a lot of positive things. People have been relatively quiet, but there's a lot of things happening behind the scenes. Lots of experimentation. You talked about sharding. You've talked about a lot of these things. But let's talk about those forces, and maybe the forces that are going to require more bravery and might not be so positive. So what are those forces as you see them?
Well, people do things for a reason, right? So some of us are working towards some sort of vision. Some of us are working towards personal goals. Some of us are working towards, I don't know, making themselves money. Different people really do have different goals. And I think in the early days, the goals were like fairly ideological. And I think as time has gone on, there's been some dilution within the space. You look around the space at the moment, and it's definitely evolving, and I see kind of something a little bit similar in the 90s with computer games, video games. Like in the early days, you wrote a video game just because it was like a form of art. You did it because you loved doing it. You had a vision of what you wanted to achieve, and you set about trying to achieve it. Towards the end, it became very kind of almost factory-oriented. People put significant amounts of cash in. Teams were big. The amounts of assets that you had to author became huge. And before long, it was really more of a business than an art form. It did that transition. Yeah. And I think when we look at golden ages, we look at the bit sort of right before the knee, right before it switches from art into business, when it's still art, but when people have really started to master the art.
Yeah.
And I think that's really the area that we're at. And I think the same forces that applied in the 90s with video games, as the big factory kind of games producers came along, I think those were slowly heading towards those times.
So one of the underlying causes, both with gaming and with just business, is funding and the sources of funding and what comes as either intended or unintended consequences of that. So can you speak to us a little bit about funding and what that will logically end up resulting in?
I think as the source of funds becomes maybe a little bit more focused on profit making rather than anything more sort of visionary, then the sorts of decisions that the leaders of projects need to take will become less ideological and more governed by very simple tactical requirements. And what this ultimately means is that we're going to see, as projects become increasingly desperate to turn a profit or to create their market cap, make it as big as possible, which sort of means the same thing, we're going to see projects taking increasingly desperate steps in order to defend their territory.
Such as?
Well, there's a lot of ways of doing this, but basically delivering stuff is difficult, right? It's really hard to build stuff. It's really easy to promise stuff. It's quite easy to have ideas, but it's really difficult to produce stuff. And as people realize that a lot of projects promise a lot, but aren't really delivering all that much, then we're going to end up with those projects needing, of course, to eventually deliver some sort of profit for their investors. We're going to end up with a sort of a mix of the kind of dark arts of communication and delivering at least a little bit of what they said.
But wait a minute, the dark arts of communication, that's like an age-old tradition in the Valley, right? You know, like that's kind of the deal. You overpromise and then eventually you deliver?
Eventually deliver on your promises is fair enough, but it may be that some of these promises are impossible to deliver.
Okay, and a little bit of the zero-sum game mentality, I think you're talking. So investors will consolidate around one or two winner-take-all type of mentality. Can you say a little more about that? Yeah,
that's right. I mean, in the early days with the spirit of collaboration in the space, it really wasn't a winner-takes-all thing, right? It was like we're all working together. The rising tide lifts all boats, sort of a theme. These days, I think with the VC mentality increasingly calling the shots behind project leadership, it really will be, there's going to be a phase of consolidation coming inevitably, and that's going to leave probably a monopoly, a duopoly, or whatever, but it's going to basically take out a lot of the horses and turn them into losers. And that's really unfortunate in the sense of the mentality behind what project leaders do. Because if they believe there's going to be a winner-takes-all kind of situation, then it's sort of the kind of tactics that they're going to employ are going to be necessarily more desperate.
So let me get this straight. So there's going to be funding which will be implicitly bring winner-take-all mentality. There's going to be a movement towards more dark arts alongside delivery of the miracles. And then there's going to be essentially chaos and war. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying indeed, yeah. I think there is every chance that projects are going to increasingly stop looking at each other as cooperative partners in building a sort of shared vision. And unfortunately, at least without like additional developments, are going to increasingly look at each other with suspicion as like competitors.
So you talked about governance as the thing that is most occupying or at least energizing you in terms of getting it right vis-a-vis Polkadot. And can you just describe and connect the dots for us between your view of what we just described, both positive and maybe not so positive, and how that's shaping your view for what governance ought to look like, and perhaps the various paths for governance that you have and or have thought about?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say I think governance has a number of there's a number of reasons that you want to introduce governance, both roughly splitting them up into internal and external reasons, right? So internal reasons are for things like fixing stuff that went wrong, that everyone can see went wrong, and sort of making everything right again, creating pushing through upgrades, technical upgrades, all the rest of it. So those are the sort of the obvious reasons, and the reasons that I think I've been mostly focused on over the last couple of years as to why governance is sort of sensible and perhaps even necessary for these systems. But there are also external reasons. This is something I think that's relatively new. So blockchains mostly have existed basically in isolation, right? They are sovereign unto themselves, but if you want to do anything between chains, then you have to go to like relatively kind of crappy atomic swap mechanisms or exchanges which are generally centralized and only work for tokens. So it's like you've got this idea of basically blockchains exist in and of themselves. And, for what it's worth, like Polkadot kind of comes along and says, well, maybe they shouldn't exist in and of themselves. Maybe we should make some way to allow them to cooperate. But that aside, ultimately, the assumption is that there's ultimately going to be kind of one winner. And therefore they won't need to operate, with the external environment. And if we instead take a view that there's going to be lots of different chains, at least for a period, then and that they're, going to be in fairly sharp competition potentially, then governance starts to make sense in a different way. It starts to make sense in terms of how a blockchain exists externally, like with regard to its peers, the other blockchains out there and whatever else. And what governance can allow to happen is for the stakeholders within a chain to come together and make, specific decisions or specific statements about the external world. Now, making statements is kind of, whatever, who cares? Making decisions might be a little different. As we know, blockchains control market caps upwards of, $1 billion. Decisions made with the backing of a multi-billion-dollar economy are necessarily going to be fairly powerful decisions, and therefore the decision-making apparatus needs to be accordingly powerful and responsible to handle that kind of authority.
So I sit on the governance committee of a publicly traded board, and there's a bunch of rules that we have to follow, either by law or by the bylaws of the company. What you're describing feels a little bit like corporate governance in one regard, and on the other hand, it feels a little bit more like nation states when you start talking about multi-billion-dollar economic forces. Like, is that fair, or is it going to shape itself one way or the other, or how do you see that?
Yeah, I mean, if you go back to the first blockchains, like Bitcoin, the assumption was that this technology, this system, this economic system, is basically it's mineral, right? It's like gold. Then you go to like sort of Ethereum, and certainly the sort of edges of the Ethereum community that can be quite pro-governance, and it's starting to we start thinking about upgrade. We start thinking about something that's sort of alive a little bit more. My assumption for like blockchain economies, blockchain systems at the moment is that they're going to be something indeed a little bit like corporations, where they've got stock, and you've got to kind of think about the decisions that a blockchain system makes would affect its economy in the same way that decisions a company or a board of a company makes would affect its stock. But I think you're right with the point of nation states. I think ultimately, although there are differences between blockchains and nation states, for example, blockchains don't really have citizens. There's no way to be born into a blockchain. There's no armies. No armies. No militia. But yeah, I mean, there are no armies at the moment.
Okay.
But in principle, blockchains...
Is that why we're here together? Are we recruiting?
I mean, ultimately, these are giant economic systems. If they go as far as we think they're going to go, then they're going to need to defend themselves against other giant economic systems.
That's intriguing. So if you think about what that means for algorithms that come together to govern something like Polkadot or Parity, what role do you see things like AI and or other tools playing, and how do those two interface?
So I look at this is something that comes up fairly often, like blockchain and AI. How do they come together? I think they basically exist on opposite ends of the computer science spectrum, right? So AI really deals with data, just data, like valueless data. It's all about turning data into basically information.
Okay.
Blockchains are kind of the opposite. They don't really deal with very much data. They can't get the throughput, but they do deal with value. The data that they do compute has real strong economic value. You can make decisions. This is the stuff of decisions. Now, if you combine the two, then basically you've got like your two ends of the spectrum covered now. You've got the ability to sort of intelligently make decisions, and now you've got the autonomous ability to make decisions, to have those decisions stick, to put real economic might behind those decisions. Now, when you've got that, it seems, at least to me, that there's not really any obvious place on the spectrum left for humans to come in and exist.
You're getting all Terminator shit on us right here, Gav.
I mean, I don't think blockchains or AI alone is going to deliver Skynet, but if you combine the two together, if you basically have machine governance and you also have machine intelligence, then surely that means we're all going to be ruled by smart machines.
Okay, let's shift gears.
Okay.
Let's talk Polkadot for a second. So, what are the things that are uniquely positioned, Polkadot is uniquely positioned to deliver? And if you think specifically about the first N projects, whether that's 3, 4, 5, whatever, before the real network effects kick into play, like what's in it for those projects? Why Polkadot?
I mean, we would aim to really seed the network effects and create something of a critical mass initially. You know, this is basically to do with bridges. So by building bridges, you know, we want to make Polkadot,
Ethereum,
right?
et cetera.
We want to make Polkadot a hub of existing chains. We want to facilitate those chains talking to each other, and we also want to facilitate interacting with those chains from new chains.
Sure.
I think. Ultimately, the value add with Polkadot won't just be network effects, but it will also be tooling.
Okay.
Right? So building Substrate, like at least I really wanted to build the best tool that is possible for creating a blockchain. Right? So I could have built Polkadot with my team. I could have built Polkadot just as Polkadot. We could have left it as a repo, like it's its own repository. It is what it is. You can hack on it if you want, but basically it's done. We didn't do that. Specifically took the decision to split Polkadot into Substrate. Now, the point of doing that was basically to say, to force ourselves to dog food, right? To force ourselves to eat our own dog food. If we make Substrate good enough to build Polkadot on, then we make it good enough for anyone else to build anything on. That was the ultimate goal.
If you had infinite time to do one thing just right now in Polkadot, what would it be?
Infinite time.
Yeah.
That's a lot of time. Infinite time. I guess like, I guess I'd wait until crypto had like caught up with the rest of the world and we could make like completely zero knowledge, anonymous arbitrary state transitions that can scale infinitely. And I build all of that into Polkadot, because there must be a mathematical equation somewhere for that.
That's a lot of scale. One of the things that's been really interesting to me is just the talent magnet that you guys have been able to attract such amazing talent. And I think part of what awesome gatherings and conferences like this is about exchanging ideas and really hopefully creating a broader talent magnet, if you will. Like, how have you thought about that with Parity and bringing such high and consistently high caliber of people together?
I mean, I don't know. It's hard to say. I read a book edited by a guy called Joel Spolsky, who's quite well known in the software space. It was actually not written by him. It's a bunch of essays, but it had one essay like the 10x coder, the 10x dev, or whatever it was called. This is basically the idea that some coders just produce ridiculously amounts more useful code than others. And the idea is that these coders tend to like coding around each other. They tend to form critical masses where they just kind of, you get a clump of them together and they just all recognize that this is a clump of 10x coders, and they tend to get attracted to it.
Sure.
I think we've been lucky enough to sort of build ourselves as a sort of crystallization point in that regard. But beyond that, I think it's just really important to ensure that everyone is focused on actually building. Like, we have like a really important policy in Parity that's basically like, you know, you can't like just sit around and have other people do your work for you. The people that get on well at Parity are the people that actually take up the work and build stuff. So
talk less, ship more.
Right.
Okay, so Satoshi left Bitcoin after the launch. You and many of your co-founders left Ethereum after.
I'm not sure if we really left Ethereum.
You're still in the ecosystem.
Our ghost still haunts the Ethereum ecosystem.
Okay, well, fair enough. Okay, so but what's going to happen here?
What's going to happen
vis-a-vis you?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I look at Polkadot as a staging ground as much as anything else.
Say more.
You know, it's a place to create. Yeah. Like you need a canvas if you're gonna build something big. And Polkadot's really, I guess it's an important piece. It is the foundation for a lot of other projects.
Yep.
You know, I would hope to be around and creating more stuff and using Polkadot and being one of the people that actually sort of helps make Polkadot's mass critical.
Cool. We're going to shift gears, and we may have time for 1 or 2 questions at the end, but we're going to do speed round. So you've not seen these topics, so I'm just gonna fire away. And the goal here is in 1 sentence or less to give an answer or response. Tabs or spaces?
Obviously, I'm not even gonna the answer is obvious. You don't need a specific thing there. Tabs.
What's your title?
Chief White Space Officer.
Okay, there we go. Okay, substrate.
It's the Linux for building blockchains.
Okay, Kusama.
It's going to be crazy.
Libra. There you go. Okay, next. Edward Snowden.
The man.
China.
Potential.
Keto.
Works for me.
Guitar.
The Floyd.
The Floyd?
The Floyd.
Oh, there you go. Berlin.
Poor but sexy.
Last but not least, whiskey.
Mine will be a Bunnahabhain 12, please.
Very good. Okay, well, with that, we have a little bit of time left for audience Q&A. So if you guys have some, or if they're, I see a minor blue screen there. So I don't think there's questions popping up on the screen. So do we have roving mics for any audience questions? Or if someone could fix this blue screen here. Is that a blue screen? Is that officially a blue screen?
That was a blue screen. I think we've kind of fixed it now.
Here, so,
there we go.
I can run the mic around.
Yeah.
Is this on? Hello?
Gentlemen,
Yes.
gentlemen in the front, please.
So earlier you said something about how competition is going to get more fierce in this space, and then there's going to eventually be a winner takes all, but you're still building a blockchain that connects other blockchains?
Yeah, the winner takes all attitude is definitely not an attitude I think is good for the space. I think there is a chance that it will become kind of forced on the space. If you look at other, if you look at the progressions of other major developments, particularly in like as they turn from the initial sort of MVP to consumer, you find that these there's a point of consolidation. So I mentioned video games earlier. There's also like, if you look at like the 8-bit computers back in the early 80s, right? They started off like with huge numbers of crazy random 8-bit computers with random manufacturers you've never heard of. There were loads of them, loads and loads of them. And then basically they all consolidated initially to 3, the Spectrum, the Amstrad, and the Commodore. And then for the next series of computers, it was just 2. It was the Atari ST and the Amiga, which was 16-bit. And then following from that, there was basically just the PC and a little bit the Mac. And the consolidation was huge. And it consolidated, and eventually the sort of, the innovation, I guess, moved to different levels. You had like expansion cards and you had software, but basically it's like consolidation, and in some sense winner takes all, does seem to be a running theme as computer science inventions become mass market. So I do wonder if, you know, the same forces that were at work there will be at work in blockchain. And if you look at some of the more recent projects, we are increasingly seeing a tendency towards closed development and closed source. Like, it was unheard of at the beginning. Like, you know, at the beginning there was one, and it was open source.
Yeah.
And within the, year following from that, they were basically all just hacks on that and open source. And then there was a few sort of interesting projects, but they were still all open source. People published their research openly. Increasingly now, particularly with heavily VC-funded projects, that's not the case. And I worry that this is, an increasing trend. And the thing is, if it is an increasing trend, then the same reasons that these people are sort of closed sourcing and becoming a sort of closed shop will be the reason that they look as an increasingly sort of zero-sum game, winner takes all, everyone's a competitor kind of attitude, and that attitude ultimately develops into very heavy competition.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't Polkadot also VC funded? How does that fit with this?
Yeah, I mean, for sure, VCs took part in it, as they did in a lot of cryptocurrencies. But ultimately, Polkadot's original source of funding was anonymous and was public. And I'm sort of comparing it to projects that perhaps never did a public round and have taken, going purely from a private round.
Any more questions?
Okay, Gav, do you want to leave the audience with anything we haven't already covered?
Didn't you have a bunch of interesting? I seem to remember in our pre-chat we had a few talking points.
I think we've covered most of them.
Yeah.
I think there's a question from a gentleman behind here as well.
Sorry.
You can probably just shout and I can repeat.
If you don't mind returning back to that thought on AI and owning value and getting good governance decisions and combining them, because that was a wonderful nightmare utopia. What role politics in all of that when, if you can actually make modernity in a sense less complicated through these functions of both the blockchain and AI, what happens to politics?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, so politics, I guess, is the idea of taking collective decisions and more or less bestowing power, bubbling up power from, in some sense, the authority of the mass of humans towards a specific polity, a group of empowered people. It basically revolves around the idea that a group of people will make the decisions for a bigger group of people.
Yeah.
Yeah? Like that's politics, right? Now, if everyone basically says, well, we're not gonna, the algorithm for making decisions, the decision-making apparatus will no longer be
one vote,
assigning a bunch of people, or in some sense not having a revolution when we decide we don't want these bunch of people to be ruling us anymore. Instead of doing that, we're going to just basically sign up to an algorithm, right? So then basically that means, well, there is no more politics. Like in some sense. I mean, it depends what the algorithm does, I guess. The algorithm could be like a parliamentary algorithm that just like cedes its power over to individuals, a small collection of individuals. But assuming that it doesn't do that and it does something else, it actually, lives the dream of algorithmic governance, of like some sort of futarchy or whatever, then there will be no politics. There will just be this algorithm that figures out what decisions should be made according to whatever, I don't know, gets oracleized into it and whatnot. And we will end up with, something quite different.
Maybe the follow-up is not what happens to the mechanism of politics, which I think you've described well there, but what happens to politics as a thing that people do? Does it just wither away, or does it fight back? And it's sort of big P politics? Maybe that's what I'm trying to get at.
So are you saying, like, will there be, sort of leader or would-be leaders and potential presidents and prime ministers all sort of coming along and saying, you don't want to have this algorithm govern you, you want me, vote me in. I mean, possibly. I guess algorithms can only continue ruling the world if they have the tacit backing of everyone that uses them. Like, this is the weird thing about Bitcoin, right? Bitcoin's a piece of software. It used to be the case that if a piece of software didn't do what we wanted to do, then we changed it and made it do what we wanted to do, right? It was a bug. So, for example, if I had a piece of software that sort of reported to me that my balance was low, I would change the software so it reported to me that my balance was high. Back in the day, in the 80s and 90s, we had, there were computer games, but people used to hack computer games so they had infinite lives, so they had infinite health. Like, it was a normal thing to do, to basically alter software so it does more or less what you want it to do. It tells you what you want it to say. That's not the case. No one's doing that with Bitcoin. Why? We're running software that is telling us stuff that we don't really want to know. Your balance is lower than you would like it to be. Why am I running this software? And the reason that we're running it is because it's a higher calling. It's not serving us. It's serving consensus. It's serving everybody, of which I am a small part. So Bitcoin can only work if everyone basically agrees to its rules, right? And it would be the same in principle with this kind of algorithmic governance. We would go along with it because we sort of tacitly accepted that it was probably the best thing out there. And if a critical mass of people decided not to go along with it, then they go along with something else, perhaps like a politician. But I think it would be sort of up to the politician to convince people that indeed that would be a better choice. And we would, if we're talking like doomsday, presumably the algorithm would know that this was a potential competitor to itself and would address it accordingly.
Yeah. Are there new titles? How are we on time? Are we good?
You've got 8 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gavin, you and I did discuss a little bit about, so how do you create stability? Maybe coming from the other end, meaning not the future back, but from the present out. So when you seek governance structures that become durable over time, there's instability in the beginning because almost by definition, founders or a small subset of initial founders or a group of founding teams have a disproportionate say.
Yeah.
How do you see overcoming that in a constructive and a smooth way?
I think it's important. Projects don't begin with a mass movement. They begin with a crystallizing seed. Most of the time, you can sort of say, "Yeah, look, there was this person or this group who had a conversation that led to a snowball effect, and and eventually we are where we are." I think it's that there's a reason for that, right? Like, there has to be some original. Like, I don't want to become a sort of intelligent design spokesman or anything, but there does have to be some original sort of idea,
vision,
right? And there has to be the initial work done to create that idea. And if you're not careful, it can much as a little candle might get put out by a strong wind. You've got to be careful before you can sort of put it into the oxygen of the wind is really going to help the small flame. Sure. So how do you turn the candle into an increasingly larger fire until eventually you've got I don't know, whatever is a productive thing that could be likened to fire, which I can't think of anything because fire is generally quite destructive, but
steam or something,
steam engine, a giant steam engine.
Yeah, big. And interwebs.
Right.
Yeah.
I guess the first thing is to ensure that there is a backup, right? There is something that will allow you to guarantee that once, for whatever reason, the initial leadership, the initial founders or whatever, stop sort of doing their job very well, that there is a transitional mechanism to move things over. And I think it's not too difficult to imagine that for a blockchain. You could hard fork, or you could, if you've got a governance, then you could sort of vote people or whatever. Now. Then the question is, is there some way of, I guess, transitioning, like forcing or ensuring that it's not a step change, right? Ensuring that it's not initially there's just one, and then eventually there's everybody, and that probably is going to be very volatile and destabilizing. And I think, I don't know, I guess this sort of depends precisely on the system. Ultimately, I think it's important to have a lot of stakeholders, a lot of early invite a lot of opinions early on, invite community, invite others to take on as much responsibility as is possible and also as is reasonable. You don't want to You don't want to sort of give core important roles to untested, potentially incapable companies, organizations, individuals, whatever. So I think, inviting people in to see the interior before they're going to be invited to take over the interior is pretty sensible.
Okay. With that, we'll wrap it up. If you have any other parting words of wisdom for the game.
Be cool. Be cool.
Be cool. Okay. With that, thank you very much for your time, patience. Thanks, Gav.
Cheers.